good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Moyatwa Sitali, and I'm the head of the country engagement team here at the Sanitation and Water for All Secretariat. While we allow participants to join us for this discussion, I would like to go through some housekeeping notes for this webinar. So just some standard webinar procedures. For those of you who have joined us before, you will realize that we do our webinars with simultaneous translation. So today we also have simultaneous translation for multiple languages. If you would like, please, you could go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and you will be able to find the English or French option. So pick the language that you're comfortable in, and that will enable you to follow the discussion closely. After several months where we've received interest from different partners regarding this topic of public-private partnerships, we're here today to be able to have this discussion on public-private partnerships in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. Now, we're not here only to discuss, we're also here to stimulate action. And for us at the Secretariat, platforms for peer-to-peer conversations are important, but what's more important is also the action that follows after this. So we'll be happy for those of you that are joining, if you're able to give us a sense of what you have picked out of this discussion and how it is helping you going forward. Without much delay, well, you could see right now on the screen the agenda that we will have today. We are excited to have our CEO, Katerina de Albuquerque, who will give us some opening remarks and also close at the end. And she's obviously available also to play other roles as we go. And then we will have a Menti exercise. We will have some case studies that we will go through, and then we'll have a discussion and close. Without much delay, I would like to invite Katerina de Albuquerque, the CEO of SWA, to give us the opening. Katerina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sitali. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. And it's also a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar to discuss the topic of public-private partnerships in the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector. And today at this webinar, we will look into how PPPs can contribute to achieving water, sanitation, and hygiene for all, always and everywhere, and where the problems lie. I must start by addressing the elephant in the room. We all know that this topic is prone to intense debate and that PPPs are not seen as a viable solution by many people, by many countries, or in many countries, or some parts of countries. On the other hand, we also know that if we want to achieve the 2030 agenda promise of leaving no one behind and ensuring universal access, as well as realizing the human rights to water and sanitation, we need to discuss all the potential tools and solutions available. A few years ago, when at SWA we expanded our constituencies base to include the private sector, our objective was exactly this one: to include and not exclude, and to broaden the solutions toolkits available to countries. And I'm very happy to see it materializing in a discussion like this one. When, in my previous role as the UN first special rapporteur on the human rights to water and sanitation, I consistently said, and this is the truth from a legal perspective, that human rights are agnostic as to the form of service provision, either public, private, or a mix, as long as the human rights to water and sanitation are realized for all, and as long as the most marginalized are not left behind. On the contrary, as long as they are prioritized and put first. The normative context, and I said also, and I still believe in it, that PPPs and the involvement of the private sector is okay and even welcome, as long as the normative content and the guiding human rights principles are respected, are protected, and are fulfilled. And I'm thinking, for example, of affordability or accessibility or quality or non-discrimination, among others. And as I was saying, I maintain it. PPPs can support the realization of the rights to water and sanitation, and they don't have necessarily to be seen as an enemy. However, we also know that for PPPs to work, and as I was saying, some preconditions must be in place, and we will talk about them today. We have organized this learning exchange because this topic emerged organically in multiple conversations we had with countries. And as Sitali was saying, particularly during our sector ministers meeting. And we think that with our partnership of over 350 partners, we do have a strong basis of knowledge on the topic, and we also have government partners with a particular interest in learning more. Our objective in the next approximately 80 minutes is to share multiple case studies that hopefully will answer some of the questions and challenges you may be facing in your country, while also providing further information to support your future decisions. During the discussion, we will be presented with multiple facets of this topic, including potential advantages, but also pitfalls and how to address those. Ideally, we want you to leave this session with ideas that give you a virtual blueprint of what are the next steps for your country to take to move forward with or without relying on PPPs towards full access to safe drinking water and sanitation. And please do not hesitate in reaching out to our secretariat if you would like to get in touch with any of the experts present in this session. So, a brief introduction. The World Bank describes the evolution of PPPs in our sector in 3 phases. First, the 1990s, where there was a surge of PPPs dominated by the large concession model and the appetite of private investors to finance projects. Between 1990 and 2000, the population served by PPPs increased from 6 to 94 million people, and the global South countries adopting PPPs increased from 4 to 38 countries. During the 2000s, there were cases of contract terminations, as well as nervousness about the benefits that PPPs could bring to the sector, including because of several instances of PPPs that revealed to be problematic and made headlines for the bad reasons. Regardless, between 2000 and 2007, the population served by the PPP model grew from the 97 million that I mentioned to 160 million. And 84% of the contracts awarded since 1990 were still active in 2007. The estimated rate of early termination during this phase is of 9%, and interestingly, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin American countries. Authors, and this is now, I think, pretty important if we are discussing this. Authors studying why some of these PPPs failed describe a multitude of reasons, such as soaring tariffs, non-payment of bills, incapability of the public sector to enforce the payment and revision of tariffs to face inflation, poor technical performance of the private sector, macroeconomic instability, conflicts between public and private actors, social and political opposition to the involvement of the private sector, lack of transparency, fluctuation in exchange rates, and change in laws and others. The third and current phase is the most targeted use or reveals a more targeted use of PPPs to manage specific subsets of activities and challenges, such as increasing energy efficiency, water availability through non-revenue water management, with a focus on performance-based contracting with payments against deliverables. The future of this management model and its optimization to respond to the most pressing human needs is to be defined by all of us, while making sure that the human rights to water and sanitation are realized for all, and while ensuring that states deliver on their obligations and private companies respect human rights and comply with the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights, which, as many of you know, encompass 3 pillars outlining how states and businesses should implement the framework: the state duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, as well as ensuring access to remedies for victims of business-related abuses. The first pillar of these guiding principles is, as I was saying, the state's obligation to protect against human rights abuses through regulation, policy making, investigation, and enforcement. And this pillar reaffirms states' existing obligations under international human rights law. So this is one bit. But then businesses also have responsibilities, and they must act with due diligence to avoid infringing on the rights of others and to address any negative impacts of the PPP. Therefore, there is a responsibility of both the state and the private sector to acknowledge their role in upholding and protecting human rights, in conducting due diligence. For example, the UN guiding principles encourage companies to conduct a human rights impact assessment through which they should assess their actual and potential human rights impacts as a PPP starts. Good. So, as Sitali was saying, and as you saw in the agenda, we want to undertake a Mentimeter exercise. So today's session builds on lessons learned by experts involved in implementing PPPs since many years ago to discuss future paths, among others. So with that in mind, and before we move to the presentation by experts, I would like to kindly ask you to access the link you see on the screen and respond to the following question. What is the main question you would like to see responded to today, and how do you expect this to have an impact in your country? So the question is there in English and in French. And please enter the code that you see above, 2625-2566 on menti.com, and please type your answer. I'll give you some time to do this. We should start seeing the answers coming in, right? So as you can see, already some answers coming in, examples of how to access money, especially for the rural water sector, practical examples of successful collaboration with government on PPP models, steps taken to convince the government, what is the role for regulators in leveling up sector performance, how effective PPPs can be established for small scale water supply. Can you please scroll? Okay. Schemes in peri-urban and rural areas. Do PPPs ever help the provision of water and sanitation for all? How to frame engagement framework between private sector and utilities. Understand latest thinking on PPPs. Get good examples, practical examples on how to implement PPPs and avoid difficulties in the design, how low-income countries can ensure that PPPs perform in accordance with human rights norms. How, can you scroll down a little bit? Thank you. How to facilitate PPPs at the local government level in a changing political setting. Corporate governance and service delivery model plus water security. I'm not sure I understand, but this person will have the opportunity to ask the question. How do we strengthen the political will for an effective PPP? And finally, how to engage PPP responsible for promoting the achievement of the SDGs. Very good. Okay, thank you so much for all these questions. I think this is already enough. And I ask our panelists to kindly, how to strengthen human rights in PPPs, all very interesting questions. And I guess, I'm sure that, I'm very sorry, our panelists will get inspired by your questions as they start their interventions. Okay, so thank you all for participating in this exercise. And without further ado, I would like now to invite Engineer Diogo Faria de Oliveira to present. Engineer Faria de Oliveira has 27 years of experience in the water sector, and he's also the founder and executive director of Defining Water Futures. At the Portuguese Ministry of Environment, Diogo is the president of the management support team of the National Strategic Water and Sanitation Plan 2020. He is also a member of the National Water Council, and he also serves as the president of the International Specialist Center of Excellence on PPPs in water and sanitation, a partnership between the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe and the government of Portugal. And during his career, Diogo served as C-level executive in multiple large water utilities and was also an advisor to the Portuguese regulator. Diogo Faria de Oliveira, you have the floor, and I will start to count your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catarina. I would like to felicitate Sanitation and Water for All for the initiative. And without further delays, go to my presentation, which will be divided in three chapters. So please, next slide. So we'll go to different PPP approaches, the sources of financing, and how to attract private sector participation. And next, please. So different approaches. Next, Vanessa. I was asked to present some cases, so I brought here 3 cases, one from Portugal, Europe, and 2 in Africa, Angola and Mozambique. So in Portugal, there are 32 PPPs. They are long-term PPPs between 20 to 50 years, and they are lease contracts and concession contracts. So they basically have private management, private billing and collection, and either private or public investment, depending on if it's a lease contract or a concession. In Angola, there are 18 provinces, and they merge the water utilities into big regional companies at provincial level. So they have 14 management contracts in the 18 provinces. These contracts are small ones from 3 years. They are now testing a 15-year lease contract in one of the provinces. So here the private party does the management, but the billing and collection is public and the investment is public. In Mozambique, they splitted the major towns, which are 17, to a fund called FIPAG, and the small towns, which are 130, into another asset management called IES, and then the rural towns goes to the National Water Directorate. In the 17 towns, they made companies, regional companies, big companies, and they are now starting to sell 49% of these companies to share risk and share investment with the private sector. And in Mozambique and in the other 130 small towns, there are management contracts and lease contracts from 3 to 20 years. So here the investment is public, but the management and billing and collection is private. So next slide, please. So basically, what we have is a big spectrum of different PPP approaches. On the left hand, we have the ones with a lower contract period and less commitment from public party. And on the right side, we have long contract periods. So in Mozambique, you have management contracts, lease contracts, and joint ownership companies. In Angola, they are starting hybrid contracts. So they have performance-based management contracts on one hand, and management contracts to lease contracts. So it's 3 years management and then 12 years lease contract. And in Portugal, we have lease contracts, joint ownership companies, and concession contracts. So basically, what we need is to adapt the PPP model to the needs of the region, okay? Even inside the country, we can have different approaches. This is basically the message. We do not have a fit-for-all solution. We need to see each one needs. So next slide, please. Basically, PPPs, they are not an objective, okay? They are an instrument, a public instrument to solve certain objectives. And these are the objectives that PPPs aim to solve. So we launch a PPP either to solve one of these objectives or two or all of them, okay? So bear in mind that the public party has not an objective of launching PPPs. PPPs are a mean to achieve certain objectives. So let's go to the next slide. Now we are going to see sources of financing, okay? Next, please. There are basically three major sources of financing. The first one is where everywhere in the world we use on water and sanitation services. It's the 3 T's, so tariffs, taxes and transfers, and other recurrence finance like donors, official development assistance, property developers, farmers, industries, house owners. This is what we use all over the world. The second one, loans and bonds. So the three first ones are the most common ones. It's money from banks, either state-owned or commercial banks, and money from international financial institutions. Then we have a more complex sources of loans and bonds, that are not that much used, but they are available. And then we have the private investors. Here again, we have the PPPs, which is the topic that we are discussing, but we have more types of investment from the private sector. When we merge these together, Vanessa, please, next slide. Thank you. We have the so-called blended finance. So what is this blended finance? Basically, is to organize public funds to leverage it on private sector. So basically, it means that if public party puts money, and if the project is interesting and feasible, equity investment will come, okay? So all of these are available. You can use all of these. if they are organized on a certain way. So next slide, please. The examples that we are dealing Angola, Mozambique, and Portugal. So in the first two, in Angola and Mozambique, they are basically using the 3Ts and recurrent finance with loans from the government, from commercial banks, and from the IFIs. In Portugal, there is a true blended finance, okay? In Portugal, we have financed 40 billion euros from European Union grants, from European Investment Bank, from private bonds, from PPPs, and from the 3Ts and the recurrent finance, okay? So we raised 14 billion to put the sector together. This happened in about 25 years, okay? It does not happen from one day to the other. So let's go to the final slide. So this is my final slide, okay? How to attract private sector participation. First, you need clear and stable laws and government. Private sector does not like things that they cannot predict. So if laws are constantly changing, if rules are constantly changing, if policy is constantly changing, probably private sector will not align on putting their money on this place, okay? The second one is sector planning. Private sector, and when I say private sector, it's not only operators, it's also investors, banks, loans, corporate finance, and so on. So they like to see planning, strategic planning, clear objectives, sound capital investment plans, and so on. Then there's efficiency, okay? In efficiency, private sector brings efficiency, but they like to have a competent and skilled counterpart. So having a good PPP unit, or a good regulator, or a good office in the, for example, Ministry of Finance is very important, because private sector sees a good counterpart to deal with. And then we have tariffs. So one of your questions is how to attract funding to rural areas and small towns. Basically, what you have to do is cluster them into big groups. Basically, it's aggregate systems to make to bring appetite to the private sector. If you cluster several rural towns by regions, you have a good PPP program. This is good not only for the private sector, but also for affordability, because it brings scale. And if it brings scale, it brings lower tariffs. Okay, so laws and governance, sector planning, efficiency, and tariffs affordable for all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Katarina.
Thank you so much, Diogo, for this very complete and interesting presentation. Also, well, for mentioning and showing the different models, and for elucidating everyone on the fact that we should be flexible, and the PPPs can be flexible and adapt to the circumstances of each country. Also, thanks for mentioning the 4 preconditions for PPPs to be able to work: laws and governance, planning, tariffs, efficiency, etc. And also for already having answered one of the questions related to small rural towns and mentioning the solution of clustering. There are other questions. There will be more questions, I think, as we advance. Diogo, do us a favor, please go through the questions, and I ask the same from other speakers, so that in the Q&A session you will be able to address even more of the questions raised during this webinar. I'm sure that we won't be able to answer them all. I think it's a good sign, but we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Now I would like to welcome Engineer Kimanti Kiengo, who is the Director of Sanitation Management from the Ministry of Water and Irrigation in our dear partner country, Kenya. And he's also our government focal point in the country. Engineer Kiengo, please tell us a bit about your experience in implementing PPPs in Kenya, and also like Engineer Faria de Oliveira, I'm giving you 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katarina, for the opportunity to share our experience here in Kenya. I want to share the legal and regulatory frameworks that we have for WASH in Kenya. And hopefully during the presentation, I will support the previous speaker in looking at what frameworks we have to attract the private sector players in the water sector. So in my presentation, I will be sharing on the 4 areas: law and governance, sector planning and efficiency, and looking at the regulatory framework, which looks at setting tariffs for provision. Like many other countries, the question of why the PPPs in the wash sector, it's in Kenya, we have, of course, the increased demand for quality services in the wash space. We have a coverage of 70% in water, 30% safely managed sanitation, which gives us an opportunity to incorporate partnerships and to bring people on board to support. We also have a funding gap, which is for infrastructure in wash sector. And with the current funding processes, we're only meeting 50%. Our government policy is to try to reduce the sovereign borrowings and to look at other sources of innovative financing. And we believe that we can be able to tap into the private sector process. And with this kind of processes, we believe we are looking at a long-term process of funding the market from the market. This also includes the local capital market will be able to the Kenyan citizen. In the next slide, the overall policy is driven by a constitutional provision for access to safe water, clean water to all citizens, and the reasonable standards of sanitation to Kenyans. So this does the whole process, and it enables us to unbundle the process of supporting the sector. For the next slide. So for this, just to give you the overall framework, we have the sanitation management portfolio domiciled in the Ministry of Water, Sanitation and Irrigation. And this looks at the whole process of sector coordination, policy formulation, coordination, oversight, and of course, quality assurance. We are also tasked to look at delivering the targets and the objectives of the Constitution to have everybody access to safe water and sanitation by 2030. And we develop instruments to be able to deliver that. We have currently a national water sector investment plan, the investment processing, and it also looks at financing for the investment plan. Gives us the mandate to look at what options we have. That investment plan has allocate the private sector domain at 25% contribution to the financial needs. Quite significant, 25% by 2030. So it's upon each of the sectors to try to unbundle that process and put in place frameworks that will support the private sector coming on board. The next slide, I'll share the frameworks that we have as a country to be able to support the PPPs in WASH. Basically, in terms of the policy, we have two main policies that guide that process: the environmental, sanitation, and hygiene policy. And this recommends and proposes the establishment of PPPs arrangement to develop sanitation and hygiene infrastructure for institutions or public places in particular. Then for our regulator, they have been able to put guidelines on sanitation levy and trade effluent surcharge, which was developed about 2 years ago. And this gives accreditation of private sector providers, in particular for sanitation intervention. This gives them the space, gives them the opportunity to come and take up and contribute to the provision of sanitation services. In terms of legislation, we have a Water Act. And again, this gives the PPPs room. City appreciates that framework and gives them a chance and details the functions as far as licensing to the provision of those services. The next slide. We also have water service regulation, which tries to unbundle the act, look at details, and this particular one, it allows agreements to be formulated, to be entered with any person, whether in the form of a public-private partnership, subcontracting agency, in the provision of that service. So the framework is right for that. We have currently now a new management. This looks basically at what the private sector can play in the whole value chain, sanitation value chain. And in this respect to this, as a country, we have been able to develop business models across the value chain, which we are promoting for the uptake of the private sector, and particularly to support the utilities to be able to provide to support them in delivering sanitation services. We have also a public-private partnership act and regulations of 2021. This is the overall procurement legislation that allows any government institution or its agencies to engage partnerships. It's basically, we are saying that in Kenya, you can be able to get the private sector to come on board. It depends on how you develop the terms of reference, the engagement processes, and this supports private sector to develop infrastructure in the water sector. The next slide. These regulations I've just mentioned are based on that act, and this act speaks to issues about maximizing economy and efficiency, promoting competition, ensuring that integrity and fairness in those processes, and of course, transparency and accountability in the process. So for us in Kenya, the policy space is quite well thought through. It's conducive. It has made the adequate provisions for the private sector to play their role. Next slide, they finish. So in terms of where we want to move to ensure that we have the private sector players on board, and I'm not giving the examples because I believe that my fellow Kenyans will share some of the case studies. We believe that regulation is very fundamental to ensure that we have standards, we have right procedures, we adhere to guidelines, we adhere to licensing conditions, and to ensure that the environment is well protected. So we are moving in the space of regulation, and we have started that for the private sector service providers in the initial parts of the value chain, particularly in the transportation space. And based to that, I mentioned that we are developing the business models that we are going to have, and we are going to promote this, led by our minister and the Ministry of Health, together with our stakeholders. And to be able to move this again, we working out on the sub-industry, particularly for non-sewage sanitation, so that we can be able to, process, and we can enable the utilities to report annually. And lastly, we want to look at how to incent to come fully on board. And for that, we are in the process of developing specific water sector, public-private sector, borrowing on the national guidelines. And this will enable us to be able to customize the public-private guidelines to the sector, to the wash sector. And we believe this will be able to take us further to the next processes. Katarina, thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your extremely interesting presentation, and also for sharing with us all the homework that and the more invisible work that the government of Kenya has been doing in order to make sure that the country has a favorable enabling environment within which PPPs can function. And thanks for mentioning again and again that regulation is fundamental, and the role that the public sector must play in order to make sure that the PPP works. For example, you mentioned now at the very end the importance of having the public sector involved in order to making sure that subsidies serve the poorest and that we leave no one behind. So basically what you are telling us is PPPs can work, but there must be a strong and constant engagement of the public sector, in this case of your ministry. There has been a very intense exchange of messages in the chat. I've been trying to do two things at the same time, listening to the presentations and trying to read all the comments. It's intense and very rich. So I ask you to all to follow the interesting discussion. There are different links and even studies being shared in the chat, and I encourage you to pay attention to them. Okay. Now, we also invited a startup from Kenya, Synergy, who is here represented by Ms. Nancy Ngao, to share some examples of their experience as a small or medium enterprise, an SME, involved in PPPs. At Synergy, Nancy works in government affairs, leading the strategic management and direction of the organization in government partnerships, policy, and advocacy. Her work involves representing Synergy in the formulation and amendment of legal policy and regulatory frameworks to strengthen the enabling environment that allows Synergy to scale while building and maintaining strategic relationships with various decision makers at different government levels. Nancy also supports PPP, public-private stakeholder knowledge sharing, capacity building to advance partnership with sector peers. Nancy, over to you now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katarina and colleagues, for the opportunity to share the work that we're doing at Synergy, particularly our PPP experience. So I just, first of all, want to just quickly take us through our solution and the work that we do in sanitation in Kenya for some of our colleagues that may not know what Synergy does. We can go to the next slide, please. So the sanitation solution that Fresh Life by Synergy, Fresh Life is the nonprofit side of Synergy that works in sanitation. So when we think of sanitation, globally, we have 4.2 billion people who don't have access to clean and safe sanitation. In Kenya, we have 10 million people living in informal settlements, with 3 million of them, 3 million out of that 10 million being in Nairobi, which is the capital city of the country. And out of that 10 million, we have 70% of these people without access to clean and safe sanitation. And that was the background of where Synergy began. So we focus on serving dense urban areas to, and as cities grow, demand grows and the challenge grows and becomes far more complicated when we think of sanitation. Next slide, please. So this slide shows our solutions. So we work across the value chain, delivering affordable solutions for safe sanitation in non-sewered urban informal settlements in Kenya. So we are in the business of non-sewered sanitation. So as you can see, we have containment, emptying, and transport. So we provide container-based sanitation toilets, or what is also known as the urine dry diverting toilet, which we install in informal settlements. We also ensure that the waste is emptied. Our emptying component is two-pronged. We have emptying from our Fresh Life toilets, but we also support manual pit emptiers in the communities that we work in by providing transfer stations, what we call mtaa fresh, which basically means a fresh neighborhood, where these manual pit emptiers are able to tip their waste at a small fee to ensure that the sanitation waste from pit latrines is not getting into the environment. For transport, we also safely take out the waste from these communities. For the pit waste, we use exhausters and it's deposited outside. And for our Fresh Life toilets, we now work with our sister company that now treats and reuses the sanitation waste. So far, our Fresh Life network, by the numbers, 5,000 container-based dry toilets operating in informal settlements in our areas of operation. We've been able to empty and remove over 25,000 tons of waste, and we are serving over 170,000 people every day. So that's just an overview of the work that we do. We can go to the next slide. So for the case of PPP, so at Sanergy, we believe that PPPs are the way to scale, particularly in sanitation. And the reason we believe this is, one, the technologies and the innovations lie with the private sector, while the mandate is held by the public sector. So in order for us to align our technologies, our innovations and projects with what the government is doing, it has to be within the scope of a PPP. The next point is that PPPs lead to scaling of existing interventions. We've heard so much about the pilot syndrome. There are several technologies and innovations that come out from the private sector, from the public sector, but it's always a pilot, a pilot, a pilot. But if we're able to construct these pilots within PPPs, we're able to scale. The next one is eliminating working in silos. So as I said, the solutions are out there, but everyone is doing something different, yet we are all seeking impact. So under PPPs, we're able to come together, merge these solutions, these plans, and implement at scale. The next one is increasing a resource capacity. So we're able to expand these innovative solutions, particularly in hard to reach areas, and harness the mutual strengths of both the public and the private sector. We're talking about financial resources and as well as technical capacity resource. Can go to the next slide. So as Engineer Chengo has given a very in-depth summary of the legal and regulatory framework that exists in Kenya, I don't need to go over that. He gave a very extensive presentation on that, but we just want to reiterate that there exists a very robust legal and regulatory framework that is providing for PPPs to thrive and for private sector to engage in sanitation. The government sanitation mandate has also expanded to include non-sewered sanitation as an appropriate solution. So when we started in Nairobi more than a decade ago, our non-sewered solutions were considered a bit radical, and we needed a proof of concept on how this could work. And we have that now with the support, of course, from the government. And today our scale and impact has demonstrated that non-sewered sanitation is viable and even critical as an option for government and utilities. So with that shift in the sanitation mandate to also include NSS, there's continuous push for an enabling environment for private sector, particularly the work that Sanergy is doing. Lastly, the government in the last decade has elevated the WASH conversation. Right now, we don't speak, you can't speak of health without speaking on sanitation. You can't speak about environment without speaking on sanitation, education without speaking about sanitation. So the sanitation conversation has now been pushed to the front by government, therefore just pushing that enabling environment to enable private sector to be incentivized to act. The next slide, please. So a specific example for sanitation and how we're, for Sanergy and how we're working within these public-private partnerships, we believe that it's very critical for citywide inclusive sanitation, particularly to serve the hardest to reach and the poorest. And we have partnered with utilities, those are the WSPs, to complement their existing sanitation solutions with now non-sewered options. So as we always say at Sanergy, our work is to complement the efforts of the government. While the government is making plans to connect everyone to sewered systems, which of course is the ideal situation, we're here to bridge the gap to ensure that everyone has access. And what does the government need? Affordable, safe sanitation and at scale, so that we can get this waste out of the communities and have the people living in these communities having access, these communities that are growing each and every year. The next slide. So this is just an overview again of our impact that I had already highlighted, but this is the impact that we've been able to make through the PPPs, through working with utilities in the different cities that we are present in. The next slide. So our proposed way forward, which is a conversation that is happening, is also government-led, is any engagement with private sector would require clear and operationalized policy that facilitates private sector engagement. Engineer Chengo has highlighted a few legislative pieces, the acts, and also the regulations that now operationalize these legislative pieces. So one, incorporate provision of performance contracts. This is between private sector and the utility or the county or the national government that will cater to sanitation service delivery, particularly in proper non-sewered settings. This is especially important in urban, informal and rural settings. Number two is regulatory approvals for sanitation service delivery. As you can see, in Kenya, we are making headway in terms of creating that legal and regulatory framework that supports private sector. So these regulations will support the private sector to secure regulatory approvals for sanitation delivery, and of course, in line with the public sector efforts to ensure safe management of waste using both sewered and non-sewered sanitation technologies, for example, the container-based sanitation. Creating incentives for private sector. Our colleague in the beginning talked about how can the private sector be positioned in terms of incentives. And that's something that is a conversation that needs to be had, to continue being had, because it is being had. Then creating opportunities for co-financing from both the national and the county level with partnership with private sector, now the blending financing. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation, and also for the focus on sanitation. We were before talking a little bit more on about water. The discussion continues in the chat. And I'm very excited about how lively the discussion is. Of course, let me now move to the next speaker. Of course, we couldn't discuss PPPs and we couldn't have any discussion inside our partnership without involving the different stakeholders, including civil society. And this is why it's a pleasure to welcome Mr. Malezi Shivaji to speak about the role of CSOs in some of the PPP arrangements presented in Kenya, but also to be the voice of CSOs here in the panel. Mr. Malezi Shivaji is the CEO of Kenya Water and Sanitation Civil Society Network, a network of CSOs with more than 30 partners. We are running late, and I ask you to kindly not speak for more than 7 minutes. Okay? Samson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katarina, and I will try to be very quick. And I will basically speak around the perspectives and quite closely related to the conversation happening in the chat about the fears and the challenges that civil society face. Next slide, please. I think first, just to say, and I think Katarina already spoke to this issue, in terms of considerations around the development framework and how PPPs fall in place, our anticipation is that they cover the entire conceptual framework for human development, but are also guided by the principles of the human rights, equality, sustainability, productivity, and empowerment, which would be at the center of our discussion. Next slide, please. Now, our understanding is that as whenever there is an increasing investment or presence of private sector, we are also seeing, and there are studies to show this, that there has been a transition in terms of how private sector engages and the kind of roles that they play within the sector. Initially, it was just management, supporting in management, but we've now seen it goes to operation and maintenance. It gets to the level of building and construction, and ultimately with almost a substitution of any investment of public sector investment, we are seeing even ultimate ownership. And this increasing trend of increased roles and responsibilities are evident and are going to be part of these more complex forms of partnerships within the PPPs. Next slide, please. The preceding speakers have spoken about why the PPPs, and as civil society would just want to point out that there are different perceptions when it comes to the public-private partnerships, and these are what then informs the manner in which the different actors engage. And indeed, Engineer Chengo has spoken about, why the PPPs increase demand for quality, reducing the funding gap from the sovereign sources to facilitate a longer-term financing, but also to tap onto private sector efficiencies. But we all know that private sector would not invest if there is no promise or an assurance of a return on that investment. And therefore, top on their list is the return on investments, and most of their priorities must make business sense for them to invest. For citizens and their representatives, we are looking at much more of issues to do with access, issues to do with sustainability of that access, the quality, and things that are much more tangible and at the heart of social development. But there are also other aspects, including the fact that when there is such an investment, there are different effects in terms of the people who are involved, including the workers in such arrangements. There are aspects to do with how the environment is affected, and so on. And I will speak about this shortly. Next slide, please. From the perspective of civil society, I would want to say that we feel that it is key that privatization or the engagement of private sector should not result into the expropriation or alienation of national assets, particularly when we are looking at the big partnerships and the associated bilateral conversations that happen between governments. And that these arrangements should be really geared towards achieving the development impacts and improving the performance of development imperatives at the country level. My colleagues, especially Engineer Chengo, has spoken about the issue of transparency and accountability. That is really key. And that there must be a continued focus on focusing on those who are most in need, even when the imperative for private sector involvement is the return on investment. Next slide, please. And I just wanted very briefly to refer to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which spoke about PPPs and their place within the sector. To speak to some of these issues, including the issues of accountability, issues of the social and environmental standards, but also making sure that there is due process around this. And I speak to this in my last two slides. Please go to the next slide. Katarina already spoke about the guiding principles on business and human rights. But in particular, she spoke about the three. The role of civil society in this case then becomes to where there is an issue of the state to protect the rights, civil society need to check that there is an appropriate environment of oversight, and that the policies and regulations that have been spoken of here before are sufficient to deliver that aspiration of that protection and achievement of the right to water and sanitation. On the company's responsibility, the role of civil society would be to investigate in case there are any violations, in case there is actual compliance, and in the event that there is deviation from what is required, then they should be, the civil society should be at the forefront of highlighting this non-compliance. And finally, when there are issues coming from victims of potential violations, civil society must be at the center of promoting for the remedial actions, including raising awareness on the issues, but also taking up action against the perpetrators, including public interest litigation. In my final slide, I just highlight these elements of the role of the civil society, and particularly point out that civil society, we must move from the general and irregular follow-up and make it more consistent, that we are actually really on toes in terms of following up the violations and issues that are contrary to all those instruments that have been spoken of. We also need to be very good at fact-checking, because whenever there are issues, there are complaints, we must have a very clear mechanisms of really confirming that this is true, so that it then becomes proper evidence with the level of accuracy that cannot be contradicted. We need to keep a record of all these facts that we collect, so that then they become a basis at the local level, but also broader for action. And finally, to use all this for purposes of triggering action, particularly from a lens of ensuring that the right to water and sanitation is respected, protected, and really fulfilled. I will stop there, Katarina.
Thank you so much, Samson. Thank you. This was, of course, a very interesting presentation about the role of civil society. In the chat, people are saying that much of what we are saying in the context of PPP should also apply to public service provision. Obviously, that we also need regulation and an enabling environment and keep KPIs and accountability also for the public provision of water and sanitation. And we all know that there are no angels, in the sense that nobody is perfect, and the public sector obviously also faces challenges, and we see that not even in cases of public provision, we know that the poorest and most marginalized are often left without access. There was a very interesting question here in the chat about informal settlements, and the decision to allow water provision in informal settlements belongs to the government. It's the government that has the power to put in place the laws and regulations that would allow for service provision. So we know that there are obligations and responsibilities on every single actor. Today we are focusing more on public-private partnerships, and this is why we are focusing more on the PPPs, right? But I think that when we use, for example, the UN guiding principles, like you were doing, Samson, and like I was trying to present briefly at the beginning, I think the UN guiding principles show that everyone has to contribute. There are responsibilities on the private sector, but there are obligations on the government, right, to make sure that there is this enabling environment in place. And this enabling environment can only be created by the public sector, right? Good. We are running late. We are already 3 minutes late. Al Hassan, I will hand over to you and ask you to be as brief as possible. Over to you, Al Hassan.
Okay, thank you, Katerina. I'll be very, very brief. Yeah, very interesting presentations, but for me, my role here is to listen. I'm not doing a presentation. I'm listening, and then I'll make a bit some comment, and some so that it will generate more discussion, and then we're not just taking this presentation as the face value. Very interesting when Diego started the presentation and said that privatization is not the end. PPPs are not the end, but it's just a means to an end. Yeah. So he said that PPPs are not the objective. So in that case, it means that we are not welded to PPPs. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the objectives? The objectives is to supply water to people and sanitation and hygiene. So in that case, in some situations, we could do without PPPs. And Katerina, you said that about 9% of PPPs have been terminated, and majority of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa and then Latin America. Yeah, so we ask ourselves, why those areas to start with? Because some of the things that PPPs want, the financing rate of returns are not there in these countries easily. And some of the countries, when you have PPPs, you have to decouple urban provision from rural provision, because PPPs cannot easily make money in the rural areas. So a lot of the concessions, you realize that they decouple the rural from urban so that they can focus on urban, and that's where they can make returns. So we have to be cautious there, why PPPs should be a bit of a caution, to throw some caution there. Now, even with sanitation, for instance, in Ghana, where I have a lot of experience in Ghana, when the PPPs were going to take place in Ghana, they decouple sanitation from water, because it's very difficult to make, again, easy money or investment in sanitation. And one of the biggest challenge, the reason why we say PPPs could be a solution, is the question of investment. And Africa alone, when you look at what the Africa Development Bank says in terms of where funding could be, if you look at our pension funds in Africa alone, Africa has a huge pension funds, and nobody has effectively tapped into this for funding. It has $130 billion to $170 billion. Yeah, that is the requirement for infrastructure in Africa to spend on water, power, and internet and roads. Yeah, that's the African Development Bank's record. But the pension in sub-Saharan Africa asset alone, it's $350 billion. So this, we're not talking about tax money, revenue that you can generate from tax. We're not talking about other government revenues. And I feel that sometimes when we are talking about what the objectives is, which could be financing, efficiency, and all those things, we're not talking about how we hold our government more accountable to use the resources that they have expeditiously. And then we want a quick fix. For a politician, instead of him to go and use the pension funds and tax money effectively, it might be easy for him to say, "Whoa, I'll bring in a private sector who has money and will fix it easily for me." And then the community or society can hold the private sector accountable and not the government accountable. So it's easy fix for governments when it's come to PPPs. And that's the danger in it. And that's the reason why in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, PPPs have challenges. Even in areas where there are strong regulations, PPPs are still having challenges. And reasons, once in the chat box, I just put one, the recent one in the US in Miami, Florida case, where one of the biggest constructors, the guys who are constructing, who constructed the Qatar World Cup stadiums, CH2M Hill, they had a concession in Miami. Yeah, 2001, that concession was abrogated. That concession was terminated because they failed to deliver. There's always this tendency of overpromising in PPPs and under-delivering. Because you want the contract, you bid and set your bid prices such a way that it's not realistic to deliver when you get it. And that's where sometimes they get cut off. So we should be very careful. I'm pleased that Kenya has the regulations and all this, but the thing is, when you are putting out your contract for bidding, companies deliberately underbid to win their contract, and then they get in and have challenges. Like what happened in Tanzania in Dar es Salaam. The Dar es Salaam contract, management contract didn't work. And we are seeing that concessions are not also the PPPs that are popular these days. There's management contracts. Because with management contracts, you, the PPP operator, you transfer the risk, financing risk to the government and the public. You only come in with your specialty of management. Government raise the money for you. Yeah. So again, one of the biggest challenges of sub-Saharan Africa is about the question of raising funds. PPPs will not solve that if it is just management contracts. It won't solve it. Ghana went for a PPP management contract. It never solved the financial crisis for Ghana Water Company. And Ghana Water Company had to take back the water company back into the public sector. And that was the end of the PPPs from RAN and VTENS, which a lot of people on this call are conversant with. Thank you. That's mine.
Thank you so much, Al Hassan. Sorry. And apologies to you, because I was so eager to give you the floor, and we are under time pressure, that I did not even introduce you, even though I know that people know you. Al Hassan is research associate and a PhD candidate at Public Services International Research Unit of the University of Greenwich, and many of you, of course, know him from the multiple roles he played in development organizations such as End Water Poverty and Oxfam. And your area of research are precisely financing and managing of public services. Okay, now we have less than 15 minutes available, and I would like the speakers to take 2 minutes to pick and choose the questions that they want to answer. I would take the liberty of asking Engineer Kiengo to answer one of the questions that was raised here, if I'm not wrong, by Zimbabwe, which deals, sorry, with the question of informal settlements. So how do we make sure that sorry, I'm looking at my notes, how do we make sure that informal settlements are served when governments often label informal settlements as illegal, right? And in my role as former UN Special Rapporteur, I visited many countries where this was indeed a problem, but I also saw countries where a solution was found for water provision and water and sanitation services to be allowed into informal settlements, be it public or private provision. That's a bit irrelevant. So I am wondering if Engineer Kiengo, you could take the floor now and answer that question, giving us the example of Kenya. Maybe
Okay.
not. Oh, you are there. Excellent. Thank you so much. Sorry, I couldn't see you.
Okay, thank you, Katarina, for that comment. In Kenya, there's a service provision licenses that are provided to the water and sanitation utilities. And in those service areas, the licenses includes the informal settlements. So it's a question of how then they should be able to provide water and sanitation services to those informal settlements. And that is articulated very well in the license conditions. There has to be a formal agreement in terms of what are the plans are and what they intend to achieve during a particular time. So that is monitored by the regulator. How they do that as utilities, it's upon them to plan their processes. In most of the informal settlements, we don't have spaces for conventional wastewater treatment, wastewater conveyance systems. So it's upon them to look at the solutions that are available. And what we are promoting as a country, the non-sewer sanitation options. And this is where the private sector can come in and is coming in to provide those in the formal settlement, basically to support the utilities to provide those services to the informal settlement. Various options. We have the non-sewer options are the big ones. We have condominium sewers in those areas, and simplify sewers and the rest. So it's upon them, and that is working for us. Katarina, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your intervention and for answering the question, which shows us the fact that there are informal settlements in a given city does not have to be an impediment to service provision. It's a question of making sure that the government addresses the issue and finds a solution. Engenheiro Diogo Faria de Oliveira, would you like to take the floor and pick some of the questions that you saw in the Mentimeter or here in the chat? For example, sure. Oh, sorry, can I give you, okay, good.
Okay, thank you so much, Katerina. So I will go just through 3 topics that were discussed here. First one, how to solve rural and informal settlements. In fact, I think that merging these with the big urban areas is a good solution. So it's like giving the profitable areas with the ones that are not at all profitable and balancing it together so we can have a good contract with urban areas and informal settlements or rural areas. Also, you should have social tariffs and pro-poor policies. This is very important. When you move to a PPP, you should impose social tariffs. You should impose some rules on pro-poor policies. This happened in Portugal as well as in Angola and Mozambique, the cases that I showed you. Actually, in Angola and Mozambique, tariffs are set by the regulator, not by the private operator or the public grantor. So this is very important as well. And finally, I would like to comment a comment from Astrid that appeared on the chat. Astrid claims that there's a huge service and financial gap, and these can only be solved with combined efforts from private and public sector. And I absolutely agree, Astrid, and I would like to highlight this message that you leave to everyone. So I think that this status quo is not working, especially for poor people. I think the status quo has to change, and I think that Astrid comment is very wisely put here. Thank you, Katerina.
Thank you so much, Diogo, for your answers and for your comments. Nancy, would you like to add anything? I'm going through our speakers.
I was catching up with the conversations in the chat, but I just wanted to add on what Engineer Chango spoke on about the informal settlements. So how we work in Sanaje had mentioned is that we work primarily in informal settlements. So there's no fear of investment as private sector, as he had mentioned, because we work through the WSPs and they have jurisdiction over those areas. So as private sector working in those informal settlements, there's no fear of investment. And just a comment here from one of the attendees is that the role of the private sector is critical for scaling up as governments and even donors have limited resources. It just brings up the whole PPP aspect of collaboration in terms of pooling resources for implementation. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Samson, anything you would like to say to address any of the questions raised?
Yes, there has been a particular conversation about the requirement that the investment must provide a return, and we agree that for private sector engagement in PPPs, it must make an economic sense on return on the investment. And in our opinion, a civil society, especially where there is investment in non-commercially viable areas. The purpose of public investment in that PPP is to provide that social protection, the subsidy, and an investment that then allows the private sector to have a return on the investment, bring in the efficiencies and the expertise, but then leverage the public resources against over exploitation of the residents. I will just put that as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samson. And at last but not least, back to you, Al Hassan. Sorry, I had here a question for you. Now, is there anything you would like to add? You made critical comments regarding PPPs. Does this mean you think PPPs can never work? Or do you think that they can be used and they can be used in a way that promotes the realization of the human rights to water and sanitation, as Diogo Faria de Oliveira was saying, and achieving SDG 6?
So
I'm putting you against the wall.
No worries, I'll address that. But just to say that, before I address your question, just to say that when you have a weak governance, a weak state, PPPs are not your solutions, okay? So when your water sector is crumbling, ask yourself why it's crumbling, but don't jump into a quick solution thinking PPP will solve it. That's what I would say. Now, back to your question, Katerina. For me, I see the role of PPPs in some situations is expertise in constructions, right? And big water infrastructures, you can tap into the engineering skills. But when it comes to the question of management and delivering water for all, especially people who would not be able to pay economic tariffs, then PPPs are not the solution. I don't see PPPs to be the solutions for the years to come. I'm not convinced. The evidence I've seen, I'm not convinced. And I see a lot of places where you have PPPs and it's down to state capture. They can't leave PPP because it's expensive. They will be sued. They have already lost their public skills, public worker skills have lost, and they are stuck with PPPs. So again, like using Mozambique, there are cases of Agua Portugal where they lost concessions with SOR in Maputo and other places. So the answer is, for me, SDGs or new versions of it, PPPs will not solve it. If 30 years ago we had stopped pushing too much banging on PPPs and look at the public sector and say, the private sector can now go on as it is in its state now. The public sector is not accountable. It should be accountable. We have to democratize it and we have to put in money, then we'll have a solution. But short-term PPPs, not the solution.
Thank you so much, Al Hassan. We have 1 minute to go, and I want to respect also your agendas. Thank you so much for this very rich discussion. Thanks in particular to the speakers, but also to all of you who are here today with us. You saw we don't agree, which is fantastic. I think that it's fantastic to have a space, and that's really how I see SWA, to provide a space for a frank and open discussion of different opinions. I think there are things that we can agree on. And one of them is that PPPs are not a quick fix, number one. PPPs should not be resorted to by governments who are overwhelmed with the sector and who want simply to delegate their obligations to somebody else. that is a recipe for failure. And I think we all agree on that here today. We also agreed that in any case of PPP or public provision or whatever, but today we were talking about PPPs, the government, the state has fundamental human rights obligations, right? And obligations to create an enabling environment within which the human rights to water and sanitation should be respected, protected, and fulfilled. The decision of a PPP does not withdraw the human rights obligations from governments, right? And the private sector has responsibilities of due diligence and etc. of respecting human rights. So I think this was the beginning of a discussion, by no means the end of it, but I think it was, I think, very enriching, as it allowed different stakeholders to come around the table, and it was a great occasion, I think, to cover different options that are on the table, but also to talk about difficulties. And I think that it is crucial for countries and other stakeholders to learn from each other and to use examples as the one we had here from Kenya. So I thank all of you for your participation and for your engagement, and let's continue debating this important issue. Thank you so much to everyone, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.